It's not like when you get raped, ladies. There's no society don't give a fuck about male rape. There's no hotline for us. Man get raped, you just gotta get up and walk that shit off. Got raped. Yeah. Caught me slipping.
Welcome to Powered by Ancestry. I'm your host, Kwesi Kunadu. This episode's topic is sexual violence and ancestry. For many, this is a very touchy and certainly a serious and important topic, and so we must delve into it. And you're probably wondering at first, what is the relationship, if any, between sexual violence and ancestry? I'll start with a story of myself when I was younger. This happened when I was probably 8 years old, maybe 9 years old, living in Jamaica. One day I went over to a cousin's house, a male cousin's house, and my aunt was not home. I had been to this house before, so I went inside. My cousin was about a year, maybe two older. And we always enjoyed going to their house because they were more well-to-do. They had a little more resources. They had, therefore, a better and perhaps bigger house. And important to me at the time, he had toys. When we got there that day, my aunt wasn't there. She had gone out on an errand. We thought no big deal. And so we began to, talk and, play around. We wanted to play. And during the course of playing, my cousin gestured or touched me in a way that I wasn't comfortable with. He said he wanted to play a game. And in my 8-year-old mind, I knew something was up, something was wrong. And so immediately I began to feel uncomfortable. I began to feel as if I wanted to go home. And eventually I did go home. And since that point, I never wanted to go back to that house. Now, as far as I can recall, and I hope there was no suppression on my part over the years, nothing did happen in terms of sexual violence. But it felt like something could have happened and would have happened if I didn't listen to or heed the call of the feeling that I had inside my gut. Now, for other people, they have experienced real sexual violence. But sexual violence isn't one thing, and it doesn't affect us only in our bodies or in our minds. You see, sexual violence has a deep reverberation that runs through our ancestry. Now, am I suggesting that only sexual violators or offenders give birth to other sexual violators and offenders? No, I'm not suggesting that solely. What I am poking at is that sexual violence is much more than perhaps we give it credit for, and it happens not simply among the typical victims of sexual violence. The word rape is often used to capture sexual violence, but the word rape is only one kind of sexual violence. I want to speak broadly and keep it broadly because the focus here is on how that violence affects and infects ancestry. You see, even though I only came close to being a quote-unquote victim of sexual violence, and even though I am a man of African descent, these two conditions leads to a question. What happens when Black men are sexually violated over generations? What happens to Black men and boys who have been sexually violated over a long period of time and for which their violation doesn't register as much as the violation of women? What becomes of these men as fathers, as husbands, as uncles, as brothers, as neighbors, as co-workers? These questions are not simply idle ones. They are at the heart of how we come to think about sexual violence. And in this episode, how is that violence related to the work of ancestry? You may or may not realize this, but there is always a shifting definition of sexual violence and rape. At one point, sexual violence was the penetration of a woman. That has changed. Sexual violence, and particularly rape, is now being defined as violation of any gender, essentially that rape is a non-gendered violation. Sexual violence is non-gendered. Anyone can be a victim or a perpetrator. And that broad definition allows for us to rethink how we think about sexual violence, but also we think about power and the ancestry of these kinds of individuals. Sexual violence does have an important history regarding Black men in this society and across the Americas. You see, as an historian of Africa and the African diaspora, I'm very much aware about what the scholarship and literature says about Black men and sexual violence. It seems almost an oxymoron, a sort of impossibility. How could sexual violence be perpetrated upon and affect Black boys and men? Is it possible for Black boys and men to be victims of sexual violence? Well, according to the new and current definition of rape or sexual violence, any gender can, in fact, be a victim of that violation. What I want to share with you is a chart. In this chart, let's focus on the top portion, control. And then we have leverage and victim on both sides of this triangle. This triangle represents the three revolving and really ongoing points that are often used when we think about sexual violence. Meaning, sexual violence is often seen as an act of control. It is also seen as an act of creating a victim. Sexual violence is also seen as an act of control that produces leverage, typically for the perpetrator. Sexual violence is also seen as an act that targets the vagina. That is sort of the common view, but there's another reason why I also want to share this chart with you. This chart is often used by the classical victims of sexual violence, women, to effectively sort of use this for their own survival. According to this model, they would talk of control, and that victimhood then is to create leverage. And then there's more talk of control to create a victim. And you can see how this particular circuit, this cycle, just continues. What holds that cycle together is the possession of a vagina. Black men, according to this scheme, they cannot be victims because they don't possess a vagina. And so even though the statistics show that Black men and boys can be victims of sexual violence and rape just as women can, they're often not viewed or understood or even responded to as victims, because subconsciously they don't have the valued resource that is key to victimhood. During chattel enslavement and up until the present, the archetypical rapist was, and perhaps is, the image of the Black man. Even though during chattel slavery, hundreds of thousands of Black boys and men were raped by white women, by older and teenage Black women, by police forces, and by white vigilantes. But we hear or read or see little about their victimhood because they, according to the scheme, cannot be victims, when the statistics and the records show that in fact they are. What does this absence of Black men being victims do for those men? I remember when my daughters were young and they would jump on my back, they would punch, they would kick, of course playing and for them in good fun. And initially I didn't mind. But once those punches and kicks and thumps while they're laughing and having fun at my bodily expense continued on, I had to pull them to the side gently, but firmly, and say to them that that hurts. That's actually painful. And they would laugh because something in the ancestral cycle of their DNA as young girls who would go into young women tells them that black men do not feel pain. Black men can't be victims. Black men are only perpetrators. Black men are only assailants. And so I continue to work with my daughters, over the years to make it very clear to them, but also to them to understand equally clearly that indeed black men have emotions, that they have emotional lives, and that they do feel pain, and that they do often experience some of the same violence, if not different violences, as women and girls. Now, I'm not sure if that message has gotten through to them or that message has been well received, but I do know that that message is a rare one, precisely because in the scheme I share with you, black men can't be victims. Black men can only be perpetrators. And as such, it is very easy and commonplace for a woman or another man in terms of same-sex relations to say that this man, this black man, in fact, has assaulted me, has violated me, has harmed me, has injured me, has given me pain. Whereas if a black man was to say or do the same, the reception of their pain, of their hurt, is least likely to be received. What does it all to do with ancestry? Well, everything. You see, the way I was raised, and my brothers, and my father, and his father, was based on a system of commands. Do this, boy, do that. I don't recall ever receiving a hug from my father, though I knew he loved me. And he didn't receive a hug from his father, and perhaps the two of them loved each other as well. You see, they had also been stamped, inscribed as perpetrators, not as victims, as people who do not deserve care and love and affection, because as perpetrators, they're simply there to what? Take away that love and affection and replace it with pain, hurt, injury, harm, and worse. And so the violence against my father, against his father, came down to me. I recall once as an undergraduate, there was a panel discussion in one of the dorms. And I remember asking this professor, who was himself also a black man, is it natural to not cry? And he smiled and sort of laughed it off. I don't recall if he gave me an answer or not, but I remember the question being asked, and I don't remember getting a satisfactory answer. And maybe he couldn't give me an answer, because I'm sure the history of men in his family was indeed that they cannot be victims of a range of violences, sexual being one of them, that they don't feel pain, that they are perpetrators, that they are without feelings or without emotional lives. And this kind of cycle continues to therefore create the kind of beaten up, hollowed out, in some cases damaged men that in some cases are doing their very best to be men and to be fathers and to be husbands and to be brothers and to be whatever else they need to be in their family, in their communities. But because that schema that I share with you is so prevailing and so pervasive, the relationship that is developed between black men and black women and the families that come out of that is often shaped by those ancestral experiences in very deep ways. I've tried to teach my daughters how to care and how to identify the areas of care with men that look like their father, and that they will, when they get older, marry and have children with a man like their father. And so it's best for them to start practicing how to relate to these men as if they do have emotional lives, as if they can be victims and not simply perpetrators. According to statistics, both black men and women are perpetrators of violence against their intimate partners around the same rate. And what's more, according to the stats that we have, this is not a matter of simply black men being perpetrators of sexual violence or other violences, or black women being perpetrators of the same violence. It is about the violences committed against couples and against families. And I would add to that, which is not in the stats, but it's the implication here, is that the violence is committed against their ancestry. Because those acts continue to what? Reverberate in the next generation. And that's why we have to consider sexual violence as not simply an act between a perpetrator and a victim in the present. That is also an act that creates a past of generations infected by that violence, and therefore people who will continue that violence. The sexual violence committed against women is certainly heinous, and there's no place or room for it. It is not simply the violence against a singular woman. Sexual violence or rape against one person is violence or rape against all the mothers who share that womb and vagina, which means effectively the rape of one or the violence against one is the violence against all those women. For men, sexual violence against them also carries an equally deep and important meaning. That violence not only robs them of their manhood, a sense of self that's so deeply important to being a man, but it also shapes their ability to do their part in the equation of a family and a community. Because where are these men to go who have this experience or have had the experience? Where do they find respite or solace? Essentially, where do they find a safe place to bleed? That is the consequence of holding on to the belief that only women can be victims of sexual violence. Because there are resources, there are institutions, there are hotlines, there are communities that will rightfully embrace and seek to heal those women and girls. But where is the same for these men? The absence of the same for these men leaves these black men and boys victimized in a way that is unimaginable for women or anyone else. And that unimaginable consequence for these boys and men is what feeds intergenerational, ancestral violence of a kind that no one else in the world has begun to appreciate and begun to resource and begun to think about anew in terms of how we think about sexual violence. I am Kwesi Kunadu. I've been your guide for this episode of Powered by Ancestry. I'll see you next time.